Let me talk a little bit about the Q&A because that's where Powell did most of his discussion. So the key was to look at the exchanges. And again, this was mostly political grandstanding where the Democrats are saying everything is great and the Republicans are saying it's not great and blaming it all on Biden, but not pointing any of the blame on Powell himself. So one of the questions had to do with economic disparity and why we have this big disparity in outcomes, particularly, minorities are not doing as well in this economy. And so we don't have an equal outcome. And this is a big problem. And what is the Fed going to do about it? And of course, there's very little, if anything, the Fed could do about it. Although the one thing the Fed could do about it is stop adding to the problem if you look at the disparity as a problem, because the Fed is a major driving factor. Now, what Powell said, the way he was going to help address this to the degree that he could, was by focusing on the employment part of its mandate, meaning the Fed has this dual mandate, price stability and maximum employment. And so in order to reduce the economic disparities out there, he said that Powell is going to focus more on the jobs and employment because he thinks that's the way to reduce the disparity, is to make sure that more unemployed people get jobs. But the reality is, by ignoring inflation and thinking that the way to resolve the disparity is by focusing on employment, that is just going to make the disparity problem even greater, because the way the Fed focuses on employment is by creating inflation, by keeping interest rates artificially low, by stimulating the economy. But all that does is add to the disparity because it doesn't create jobs. You don't create jobs by creating money. You don't create jobs with inflation. Inflation helps to widen this disparity gap because what they're doing is they're propping up asset prices that benefit the rich, while at the same time suppressing real economic growth that would benefit the poor and the middle class. They are helping to move money from Main Street to Wall Street. If the money was still in Main Street, if we had higher interest rates and capital investment, that would help grow the economy and lift real wages. Instead, we shift that money so that it can be used to finance financial speculation on Wall Street. None of this benefits Main Street. The rich get richer because they own the assets, and the poor get the shaft. Because inflation, while it drives up the assets that the poor don't own, it also drives up the price of all the goods and services that the poor need to buy or the middle class need to buy. So by ignoring inflation, by creating inflation to supposedly focus on employment, the Fed is actually making the problem worse. It's making the rich richer, the middle class and the poor poorer. That is the biggest irony of the whole conversation, is that the Fed is partially to blame for what the Democrats want the Fed to solve. The Democrats want the Fed to solve a problem that the Fed helped create. And they want them to solve it by doing more of the very policies that created it in the first place. Now, another question he was getting was about infrastructure, because, the Democrats have this infrastructure bill where they include just about everything in infrastructure, and they're trying to get Powell to acknowledge that the Democrats' definition of infrastructure is correct, but he really doesn't want to do that. And then when they try to put words into Powell's mouth, Powell kind of says, well, I guess that's okay. So, he never wants to contradict what any of the politicians are saying because he doesn't want to risk getting on anybody's bad side. But what nobody asked Powell about infrastructure, and of course, Powell didn't volunteer this information, nobody said, regardless of how you want to define infrastructure and what you want to include, the question is, can we actually afford to spend this money on infrastructure? Because then the answer would be no, we're broke. How are we supposed to afford new infrastructure spending when we're already broke? We have this emergency, we have this pandemic, so the government is already spending all this money trying to bail everything out. How do we have extra money to spend on infrastructure? Even if in the long run, that infrastructure is going to ultimately bear fruit and produce, positive returns, which we don't know, but maybe it will. But we can't afford to do it right now because we have other things that are supposedly more important. No, they believe that the way to stimulate the economy is by spending this money on infrastructure. But no, that doesn't stimulate the economy. That just creates a bigger burden for the economy to bear. And if the economy is weak right now, we can't afford to spend money on infrastructure. What we need to do is wait for the economy to be strong, and then in theory, we would be able to do it. Or at least we pay back a lot of the debt that we've accumulated for consumption before we actually have some real savings that can be devoted to legitimate infrastructure. But also along those lines, Powell was asked about the debt and whether it's a problem. I think it was a Republican asking about this big surge in deficit spending, and is this a problem? And, the Fed has acknowledged, and Powell has acknowledged, that the debt is unsustainable. So does he see a problem? And of course, Powell immediately said, look, it's not a problem right now. I mean, yes, it's unsustainable, but it's been unsustainable for a long time. So that's nothing new. So, we don't want to blame the Democrats or Biden for an unsustainable debt, because it's been unsustainable for a long time. And so there's nothing different now, right? He doesn't want to acknowledge the fact that the debts are now off the charts. So if it was unsustainable before Biden, well, it's even more so now. He did not want to acknowledge that. But what he then did say is he specifically said, yes, it is a unsustainable problem that's been around for a long time. But he said now is not the time to do anything about it. He said the time to do something about this problem is when we have a really strong economy, when we have low unemployment. That's when we want to tackle this debt problem. But now, when the economy needs stimulus, although, he talked about how great the economy is, how strong the economy is. Well, if it's so strong, why does it need stimulus? He keeps contradicting himself, but he thinks that the economy needs stimulus now. We still have too many unemployed people, and so now is not the time to deal with this ticking time bomb with the debt, but he does want us to deal with it at some point in the future when the economy is strong and when all these unemployed people have jobs. Then we can tackle the debt. But the problem is, a couple of years ago, when Donald Trump was president, Powell agreed with the Republicans, and he agreed with Trump that the economy was great, that the economy was booming, that the economy had never been stronger, right? Donald Trump was saying we've got the strongest economy in the history of the world, and Powell wasn't disagreeing with any of those statements when Republicans reiterated them in hearings in which he was testifying. They talked about the lowest unemployment ever, record low unemployment for African Americans, record low unemployment for women. Powell was agreeing with all this. He said everything was great, yet not one time during any of his congressional testimonies did Powell ever say, hey, let's do something about the deficit, guys. We got a really strong economy now. We've got really low unemployment. Now is the time to tackle this deficit problem. No, Powell said nothing about it, because it's never the time. This is the same BS answer that they always give. When the economy is weak, they say now's not the time to do anything about the deficit. We need to wait till the economy is strong. But then when the economy is strong, they never want to do anything about the deficit then either. Here's the problem. The only reason the economy is strong is because it's phony strength. It looks strong because we run up the deficit. We can't do anything about the deficit because that will make the phony strong economy weak. So if the only way we get the economy to look strong is by running huge deficits, well, how are we going to attack the deficit problem without ruining the economy, right? The phony economy. So they know that any recovery that's built on a foundation of deficit spending, the government can never do anything about the deficit, because then they're dismantling the foundation of the economy and it collapses. So it's all a lie. They never have any intention to do anything about the deficit when times are good or when times are bad. The only time they're ever going to do anything about a deficit is when there's a crisis. Now, I guess fortunately or unfortunately, depending on your perspective, a crisis is coming.